You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C.
And I'm your co-host, Katie Putz, also back in Washington, D.C. now.
Good to be back, Katie. How's it going?
It's been a crazy couple weeks, I think.
It really has, yes. For certainly for the world, I think a lot of people were messaging me on Twitter asking when we would do a podcast on events in Ukraine and their fallout on the rest of the world. And I'm actually glad we waited a little bit because it's obviously very difficult. I think it's still quite difficult right now to say much that's useful about the broader geopolitical ripples that this will send through the world. Although I do think we have some indicators that we can talk about today. But first, I just want to tell our listeners, I think we'll end up doing multiple podcasts. There's no way we can do justice to the full range of issues that deserve discussion. And obviously, first, I think it deserves saying that everything we're going to talk about, we're not going to focus on the actual situation on the battlefield and the horrific human suffering of the Ukrainian people, but that's certainly not to say that those issues aren't certainly on our minds. But we cover Asia, so we will stick to that, and we'll talk a little bit about the ripple effects. So, how does that sound, Katie?
Yeah, that sounds great. There's definitely a lot to talk about, but I think certainly after the first week of March, and it's March 9th to when we're recording this, there are things we can talk about. I think we should start with sort of the big question in Asia, which is the Russia-China dynamic and how that's affected by Ukraine. What do you think about that? How has China responded to the invasion of Ukraine and sort of the Russian, isolation from the rest of the world, with the exception of China?
Yeah, so it's been pretty fascinating, right? I mean, the context was before the Russian invasion on February 24th, just 20 days before that, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping were shoulder to shoulder in China. And they
Having a good time at the Olympics.
they issued a very, very long and detailed joint statement covering pretty much everything the two countries cared about. Russia scratched China's back on Taiwan, and China scratched Russia's back on Ukraine. Both sides sort of recognized each other's legitimate security interests and core interests. And so then when the invasion happened, it was sort of interesting to see the scramble of sorts in China's reaction, because we saw sort of mixed messaging, right? Depending on where you looked within the Chinese bureaucracy, and I think this was true in the early diplomatic statements, you would see China sort of emphasizing its longstanding foreign policy principles of non-interference and sovereignty that really go back to the early Cold War days of non-alignment, and have been longstanding Chinese principles, the sort of five principles that China's talked about for a long time, and these are important to China, right? Territorial integrity and non-interference have particularly important implications for China's own interests. But then, fast forward now to March 9th, I think it's pretty safe to say that China and Russia are once again shoulder to shoulder, that it's pretty unambiguous to me at this point that China has decided that the way it's going to play this, at least right now, if and until Russia decides to escalate this in a way that might be even too much for Beijing, which I don't know what that threshold would be, China's decided that right now its interests are better served by siding with Russia. And the way in which that support is manifesting, I think, is also interesting to me. China, I think actually the biggest part of what might have made this shift from early ambiguity after the invasion began to a little bit more clarity is the actual range and extent of the international sanctions on Russia for the Ukraine invasion, which is not only unprecedented and not only delivers on the assurances that President Biden and NATO and EU countries had given Putin before he invaded, but have actually exceeded those assurances in many ways. And the private sector has followed up its own accord in ways that also exceed what's required legally by sanctions. And that's just something fundamentally that China has always had issues with, Western use of sanctions against other countries for whatever reason. And it seems to be in this case, even when we have what is pretty much the most outrageous and unambiguous violation of the UN Charter in ages. China will vote on the one hand to abstain on resolutions at the UNSC and the UNGA, which is good. It's much better than China actually voting with Russia. But in practice now, I think Beijing has decided to cast its lot in with Putin. None of this, though, I think the narrative that is perhaps getting a little bit out of hand in DC, or I at least think is premature, is this idea that, and I mean, this has been part of the narrative for the last 2 years, which is that are China and Russia allies, or are they sort of in an entente where they have their differences, but they're putting them aside or putting them on the back burner right now because they have much bigger fish to fry in terms of what their visions are for the world order. And my sense is that nothing I've seen since the invasion of Ukraine happened really changes the basic, um, assessment there, which is that they're not allies still. I think, depending on how far things go, China could well reassess the value of siding with Russia. But right now, I think Beijing is all in. What's your take on this for the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think has been interesting to watch the dynamic between Russia and China. I know there have been some reports that maybe they discussed this during the Olympics. I don't know what to make of those, but I think China's in a bit of a difficult spot in the sense that it does not like the sanctions, as you mentioned. It doesn't like that as a mechanism for the international community to pass judgment and try to sort of persuade countries to do or not to do certain things. Doesn't like that. But on the other hand, China has had sort of territorial integrity and non-interference as these core features of its foreign policy. How does that apply to Ukraine? What about Ukraine's territorial integrity? What about Ukraine's sovereignty? And I think that it raises kind of interesting and awkward questions that I don't think Beijing is really ready to respond.
Mm-hmm.
And I think certainly in Asia, watching what's happening in Ukraine, if you're in Singapore or South Korea or Japan, you're looking at China and going, are they going to do this to someone in our neighborhood? And so, I was going to ask you, how has the invasion of Ukraine sort of altered the dynamics in Asia when looking at China? And how do you think that's informed, say, the South Korean and the Japanese responses, which I think have been more robust than people assumed they would be?
Yeah. Well, so I think Japan and South Korea were in two different baskets because I think Japan, as part of the G7
Mm-hmm.
consultations, had been sort of prepared in a way that, I mean, Seoul actually caught up pretty quickly. They were initially a little hesitant about the full extent of sanctions. They still have a few carve outs. Yeah, the two of them, I think, have basically played this as one would expect them to, as sort of liberal democratic members of the developed world. They have used their high tech supply chains, economic linkages with Russia, to apply sanctions in a way that I think will be effective. For Japan, I think the invasion marks the end of what has been a long running, almost 10 years actually, since Abe's reelection in December 2012. Yeah, almost a 10-year process of trying to improve relations with Russia,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, like I can't see there being a peace treaty now.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Northern Territories, economic engagement with the Russian Far East, all of that, which had been built up under successive summits between Abe over his very long prime ministership and Putin. All of that is out of the window. I think Tokyo is fundamentally recalibrating. I think for
Mm-hmm.
many of these countries, it's I mean, it's not just these countries, right? It's basically every. I mean, at the United Nations, it's like the African countries. I mean, the Kenyan ambassador had this remarkable statement where
Mm-hmm.
basically it's like, what is the value of multilateralism, the UN system, when a member of the P5 with a veto at the Security Council and
Just
thousands of
invade another country.
thousands of nuclear weapons, behaves in this way, violates the UN Charter, invades another country. I mean, so, if there is any value in multilateralism, international law, a so called liberal international order, if that exists or not is perhaps up for debate. The value is in this idea that might cannot make right, and that smaller countries will have recourse in global institutions. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think the reaction that we've seen from, you brought up Singapore. I think Singapore is actually a very, very good example of this because Singapore is sort of the classic example of a country that almost never resorts to sanctions or to sort
Mm-hmm.
of condemning other countries. But I think the Singaporean foreign minister, Viv Balakrishnan, basically said, this is an existential issue for smaller countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the world is allowed to, become this place where, the sort of classical realist world where the strong do what they will and the weak will suffer what they must, countries like Singapore simply can't survive. And so Singapore, for the first time, implemented sanctions in a way that they hadn't in a very long time, I believe,
Yeah.
since the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. And
Yeah, and
so,
I think we saw that a similar reaction from, say, the Pacific Island states,
yes, yeah,
which by and large lined up to co-sponsor the UN resolution on the second. Not that they can physically affect or even economically affect the situation, but I think you put it well that it's an existential issue for small states if their large neighbors can just eat their territory.
yeah. Um,
Because if we let this happen in Ukraine, what's to stop? Um, China from picking a small island country in the
Yeah,
Pacific.
Yeah, and there were some I'm thinking about the UNGA vote, and there were some interesting there were some votes that caught my eye. I was personally sort of disappointed to see Vietnam abstain on the resolution, despite
Mm,
if there's any country that can understand the situation Ukraine is in, it's Vietnam, which was also invaded by its superpower P5 neighbor that it shares a territorial border with,
yeah.
and fought a war. But again, I mean, I think here we start to get into maybe what we can discuss next, which is the sort of balancing act that a lot of countries are trying to do in terms of
Mm.
the self-interested relationships that they have with Russia. And I think, who I'm really talking about here is India.
I was gonna say you're talking about India because I think that's one that I've gotten the most questions about from friends, family, and random people on Twitter is how to explain India's hesitance to
Mhm.
sort of stand with the rest of sort of the democratic world. India, the largest democracy in the world, is taking a very cautious line when it comes to Russia. How do you explain that?
Yeah, no, I've been getting a lot of questions about this too. I mean, I think it's interesting because I think this crisis has genuinely put India in a very difficult position. I think
Mm,
it's not actually clear to me that Indian policymakers appreciate, or perhaps they just don't care about the effect that this is having on how India is perceived in the Western world, right? I mean, this is after the Modi government has already been receiving a lot of criticism over
true.
its democratic bona fides, particularly over the last few years. But now this moment has, I think, sparked a lot of very overt criticism of India that, this is the most significant global crisis, systemic international crisis in a long time that sort of affects the very fundamental values of the UN Charter, and India sort of fence sitting, right? And it's not just fence sitting. I mean, there were some pretty, I think, terrible optics for New Delhi. I mean, India's ambassador to the United Nations was speaking at the Security Council at that very dramatic session that was occurring at the very moment when the Russian
As the
vehicles,
invasion was happening.
as the invasion was happening, and it was like this classic example of dramatic irony where half the diplomats in the room knew that the invasion was happening, but the ones who were speaking first didn't. And so the Indian ambassador was speaking, and he was sort of using the phrase, legitimate security interest to describe Russia's position. And by the way, this was also a phrase exactly used by the Chinese envoy at the same time. So for an outsider, it very much appeared that forget the Quad, forget the Indo-Pacific, forget all of the U.S.-India shared values that we've been talking about for 15 plus years now. When it comes to when things really start to hit the fan, India and China start to sound a lot like each other. And so the explanation that I have for this is, I mean, first of all, I think bureaucracies are not famous for, or at least the Indian bureaucracy is not famous for adapting very quickly to an international crisis. And there's a very strong, I think, Cold War hangover in terms of how many senior strategists and thinkers on international affairs conceive of Russia's role in the international system, right? It really
Mhm.
goes back to the Cold War. I mean, senior Indian thinkers will bring up the fact that in 1971 Richard Nixon dispatched the USS Enterprise carrier strike group to the Indian Ocean, and the Soviet Union was backing India, and so there's this sort of undercurrent that India is never really fully into the liberal democratic world, in
Mhm.
the way that perhaps boosters of the Quad might like to see it. And I think this crisis has sort of laid some of that bare. But then there's also the self-interested component, which I think is actually perhaps a much more important driver on the Modi government's policy, because I do actually think that the Modi government, at least at the highest levels of national security thinking and strategic thinking, doesn't have that same level of Cold War hangover in terms of seeing Russia as this sort of indelible partner that India must keep good relations with. But I mean, fundamentally speaking, it's just the fact that the Indian army is sitting on heaps and heaps of Russian military hardware that it needs, spare parts, maintenance capabilities. It is co-developing weapon systems with the Russians, like the BrahMos.
Mhm.
There are several dependencies that are very difficult for India to wean itself off of. There have been calls for a very long time for India to do this and sort of to fully integrate itself with the United States, which is increasingly a much greater supplier of arms and equipment to India. But again, it's very difficult to just turn those legacy systems over, change those
Mhm.
over overnight. And so India really doesn't have a very good option here. And the other issue is that the most proximal Indian interest that sort of changed in what Indian officials were emphasizing after the invasion began was the safety of Indian students in Ukraine and Indian citizens in Ukraine. Ukraine just so happens to be a very popular venue for many Indians to go overseas to study medicine and other issues. So when the war started, there were many Indians caught in the crossfire, including one at least, one student who was killed in the fighting in eastern Ukraine, and so that became a very prominent priority as well. So, I mean, that's, I think, the basic contours of why India's reacted the way that it has. But I do think it's sort of prompted, I think, a much more robust debate than I've seen in a while in DC on the nature of what India really is hoping to accomplish in the international system. So,
Mm-hmm.
so Katie, we've talked about the Russia-China relationship. We've talked about some of the reactions around the region. I wanted to sort of actually pick your brain on what I think is actually a very important effect, and where perhaps China might even have an opportunity if it sees an opportunity in this crisis, which is the ripple effects that this is having through Central Asia. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
economic dependencies between the former Soviet states in Central Asia and Russia are huge. You have massive amounts of remittances, primarily that were coming in the form of the ruble, which is a currency that has all but been, rendered. I mean, it's just been completely smashed. And
Mm-hmm.
I can't even begin to. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I have barely scratched the surface of the Central Asian reactions. I would be curious in your thoughts on the call that Tokayev had with Zelensky, because that sounded quite awkward. Because we just had a podcast where we talked about the fact that Russian troops were on Kazakh soil just a little more than a month ago at the invitation of Tokayev. So there's a lot to talk about here. So why don't we begin with the economic piece though, because that strikes me as perhaps the more important. So what is Central Asia thinking about all of this?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, and actually, I'll just plug a little webinar we're going to host next week on the 15th. I'll be hosting with a couple of my favorite Central Asianists to discuss this more broadly. But the economic piece is it's a real disaster in Central Asia. I mean, the value of a pair of World Bank economists wrote a piece last week looking at the effect on remittances of the conflict in Ukraine, and 2022 previously they had forecasted the value of remittances to grow 2 to 3% in all the Central Asian countries, sort of coming back from the COVID slump. It's now across the whole region forecasted to decline by 25%. And in
Wow.
Kyrgyzstan, that will be a decline of 33% because some 80% of Kyrgyz remittances come from Russia. And so, as the value of the ruble sort of goes through the floor, it's not only dragging the Central Asian currencies, but it's just destroying the value of what sort of the millions of migrant laborers from Central Asia who work in Russia, the value of what they're sending back is cratering. And so that's the real and like already happening effect. And then you have, the effect on food prices, the effect on just business in general. And I think one thing worth watching is sort of the effect that this conflict has on the Eurasian Economic Union, which Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are members of. Russia has been sort of prodding Tajikistan and Uzbekistan to join for years, and they've always kind of been flirting with it. But I can't see that happening now. It seems like a terrible idea because the value of that is just gone.
Right.
Joining a Russian sort of economic union at a time like this doesn't make sense. So that's the economic piece is pretty devastating. And if you think about the social unrest that there has been in Central Asia over the last 2 decades, every once in a while there are protests in almost all of the countries. Those are almost always linked to socioeconomic issues. So if people were mad about the economy before, they're going to be even more upset now. And so that's pretty bad. On a government level, the Central Asian countries have sort of, I think, taken the only reasonable path that they can, which is to try to stay neutral. There's not really a
Right.
benefit to them if they, for example, in the UN vote had voted to condemn Russia, that would have gotten them absolutely nothing. All of the Central Asian countries either abstained or just didn't vote, which, if you look at Kazakhstan specifically, is a very interesting, and I think that's about as strong as a pushback as you could possibly get, because as you said, in early January, the president of Kazakhstan requested a CSTO intervention. There were 3,000 Russian troops that deployed to Kazakhstan's largest city to help sort of restore order after the protests and sort of the chaos that had been happening there. And there were some that at the time sort of talked about it like, oh, Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy is out the window now. They're going to owe Russia a whole bunch. It's pretty clear now from Tokayev's uh, reactions that if there was a debt, they're not paying it, because Tokayev has sort of offered up Kazakhstan as a mediator, which is also very classic, I think, Kazakhstan offering. And as you mentioned, this phone call between Tokayev and Zelensky, that happened right after like the same day that he had a phone call with Vladimir Putin. So in the same day he spoke to Putin, and then I believe the Ukraine call was at the request of Ukraine. So Ukraine was like, hey, we want to talk to you. And Tokayev took the call. So we don't really know what they talked about any more than your generic readouts from these kind of things. Just says, they discussed the conflict and everybody wants it to be over. But I think Kazakhstan certainly would like this conflict to end. There's always been if you go back to 2014, Vladimir Putin made very similar comments about Kazakh statehood not really existing that Putin made in his, January 21 speech about Ukraine, sort of calling its statehood a fiction. That echoed in Central Asia. I think people paid attention to that. That from at least in Vladimir Putin's mind, these Central Asian states were part of the Soviet Union, and maybe they should be again. And I think that's a concern I think people have. We have seen, one last thing I'll mention is there was a fairly large rally held in Almaty, Kazakhstan, which is Kazakhstan's largest city, and was the site of the most violence in January. That's an important factor in this. The government allowed this rally to go ahead, gave permission for it to go ahead. It was a pro-Ukraine rally, and so at which people were saying like Kazakhstan should leave the CSTO, Kazakhstan should leave the Eurasian Economic Union, and the government did not put that protest down. So I think that is something worth paying attention to, because I think as the economic pressure ratchets up, the social pressure will ratchet up, and that might have political consequences in the region.
That's fascinating. The other thing I wonder about, and so, yeah, I take your point that it's very difficult for Central Asian leaders to turn their back on Russia. I don't think any of them can, for practical reasons and economic. I mean, well, I guess that's really what my question is about. I mean, if you're looking at the Russian economy, the scope of these sanctions, the fact that even if in the best case scenario, the war ends and sanctions relief is part of some post-war deal with Russia, and the West lifts all these sanctions. I mean, it's very difficult for me to imagine Western companies going back into Russia, that the Russian economy recovers in any way that's going to be quick enough to really make a difference. And so if you're sitting in Central Asia, you're going to look to the East and you're going to say, maybe we've been betting on the wrong horse for the last 30 years. And
yeah, I mean, I think the thinking is, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because, just as much as Central Asians might be in Kazakhstan in particular, might be worried about Russia trying to pull a Ukraine in northern Kazakhstan, for example, they're also not really keen on China in terms of its own territorial ambitions. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Central Asian borders with China had to be negotiated, and some of the Central Asian states lost territory, and that's a thing that came up in 2016 in Kazakhstan. There was a series of protests. The short version is that the government was proposing and planning to change a land code that would allow foreigners to rent land for a much longer period of time than had previously been allowed. That got kind of parlayed into oh no, the Chinese are going to buy up all of our territory. So there's also an anxiety about Chinese intervention in Central Asia that mirrors the anxiety about Russian intervention. And so I think you're right. There certainly will be more impetus to further diversify Central Asian economies away from those two major partners. I think that's going to be difficult because, geography is very hard to fight. And so it will be interesting to watch. I think there might be space for greater European involvement, greater Turkish involvement, in the aftermath. But it's certainly a question I think Central Asian leaders will be thinking very hard about is, how tied are our economies to these neighbors that don't necessarily take what's going to happen to us in consideration when they sort of pursue their own interests.
Yeah. Well, Yeah, I think we'll be definitely due to track this as it goes forward. So I think, Katie, let's wrap it up here for today. But we've scratched the surface on this, so I'm just pretty certain that we'll be back to talk about Ukraine soon. We didn't really talk about a big question that has been coming my way at least, which is what does all this mean for Taiwan, if anything? What does this mean
Yeah, we might
for
have to do a whole episode just on the Taiwan question. We can
yeah,
invite
and
someone.
the assumptions about how great powers fight modern wars, and
Hmm.
are is the Russian armed forces. I think there's a pretty interesting debate happening now about whether the complete collapse of Russia's invading force in Ukraine is, what lessons does that send other
Hmm.
countries, and what does it say about the role of modern technologies in warfare and things like that. So, a lot more to talk about. But it was good to
Absolutely.
do this again. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, definitely. We'll keep following this, and I'm sure we'll record another podcast on sort of the military angle, maybe.
Well, thanks for listening, everyone. If you like what you heard on the show, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes, including follow up discussion on the conflict in Ukraine. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. That really helps the show, and you can do that anywhere you get the Asia Geopolitics podcast. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.